Everybody, and welcome back to the final session of virtual TINTech London Market, where we are looking at data. So following on from the previous panel discussion where we left it there, and as Phil's pointed out in the chat, where we finished saying data is the new soil rather than the oil upon which our companies grow and add value. And it's a good starting place actually for this discussion, where we're looking at developing a data strategy that will enable end-to-end digital processes. As always, we want to make this as interactive as possible. So do put your questions in the chat, and we will include those as we go through the session, and take part in the polls as well, and take part and you get to see the results. The format for this final session is a panel format, which I will introduce the panel shortly, but also do put those questions in the chat. We've got 3 questions that have already been submitted around the challenges of data, which we're going to work through, but if you've got your questions as well, that'd be super. So let me introduce the panel. We have 3 panelists today. Abdul Malik, who is a Chief Data Officer at Talbot Underwriting, Enrico Alessandri, Vice President Systems Processes at Swiss Re Europe, and Dan Klein, who's Director of Solution Center at Zilker. And just while I switch on their cameras and their mics, Ellie, could you put the first poll up, please? And what we'd like to know is, how mature is your data strategy? So here's 10 seconds on the countdown clock. So firstly, welcome everybody to the panel. Hello there, good afternoon. So quite interesting results there. Most people still in the development phase, I would say, although a significant proportion have already got a strategy and a plan in place. That's pretty positive, I would have thought. Anyone got any thoughts on that? Dan, does that chime with you, what you see in other industries as well as insurance?
I think it does, yes, thank you. I think possibly an observation might be that one of the things about data in particular is that there's quite a lot of unknowns. So we would worry that it's strategy and plans rather than test and learn. And I think when you're trying to do something new, to do a big strategy and a big plan, it's quite difficult to get the rubber to hit the road. I'm minded by Blueprint 2 talking about the rubber hitting the road with Lloyd's, for example, making that something that is a test and learn culture, so you actually have a feedback loop on what you're doing. It's quite important. You need to be able to flex that strategy and that plan based on what you learn as you start to do things. Yeah. So I think that's probably the bit that we would worry about the most.
Yeah, and we can come over to, well, we are going to come on to some of those practical challenges as we go through the session. I'm going to bring up the first question that we've had. So what are the key criteria for developing a business case for your data strategy? And perhaps I could fire this at you, Abdul, first, and just to get a sense of how you prioritize investments and decisions around data within your organization. Oh, you're on mute. Let me...
Yep, can you hear me now?
Yes, indeed.
Great, okay, so thank you. So I guess I'd probably answer that question probably this way. So it's probably important to kind of understand what a data strategy is. So a data strategy is really an articulation of how you're going to deliver your business strategy using data to get there. So, both obviously business strategy drives the data strategy, and obviously equally the data strategy informs the business strategy. So I think critically, the data strategy needs to have a clear link in terms of how it's going to unlock the value of data and how it aims to achieve the strategic business imperatives. So in terms of how you link that, so in terms of what a common mistake is, actually, I think this is where the challenge often lies. It becomes a technology blueprint that's either owned by IT, or it's a reactive response to, organizational anxiety that we're going to be Ubered, so we need to embark on some adventure in data science. Hence, we might have loads of strategies and plans and quite detailed view of what it is that we need to do. I think some of these are, absolutely well-intentioned, and I'll concede this is probably a mistake I've also made in the past. But I think the key thing is actually from an exec board and stakeholder perspective, what they're interested in is actually the so what. What is the aggregate effect of our efforts? Are we looking to make money? Is it looking to save money? Is it looking to save time? Is it looking to mitigate risks? And the important factor really in terms of when you're choosing the criteria is actually to understand where your data efforts fit in terms of the value chain. Because the key thing with data is actually it's not a competitive differentiator, and what you accomplish with it is. And as Daniel mentioned earlier, is actually you need to have the hypotheses in terms of where you think the value is going to come from, either if it's going to kind of do things faster, cheaper, quicker, so help you save money, or it's going to help you to grow your account, or launch new lines of business. And it's almost like having to perform that test and learn to validate the hypotheses, because it's incredibly difficult to kind of have a multi-million-pound business case that is well articulated without having to do the work, especially if it's new.
That's really interesting. Dan, have you got some thoughts on just to build on that, Dan?
I was just going to violently agree with that. I mean, so weirdly, we're quite provocative in the market when it comes to talking about data strategies, because for exactly the reasons that have literally just been outlined in some senses. We talk about actually the value is in how users and consumers and managers are using digital products. Now, they're underpinned by data, but the value is in how they are being used, how consumers are writing, how users are writing insurance. And you have to get the data to work for you, but the data is not the thing in that sense. The thing is the digital engagement that allows you to understand risk, allows you to take cost out, and that's all services that you're doing to customers or users within your organization, or whoever is actually actively getting involved in that digital service. That's where the value is. You have to get the data to work for those services, and you have to do it through test and learn, through some hypotheses of how you might go about it. If you want to rethink assets that you're insuring, that's great, but you probably need the data to do it. But actually the value is in rethinking how you insure those assets. The fact is you probably need data to do it and to underpin it, but data is not the be all and end all, shall we say. It's not the holy grail. It's only the beginning of potentially some things that are very valuable to you.
Yeah. Dan, you just stole my thunder, because that was exactly the point I was going to make, where data is like flour. And if the objective is to have bread at the end of the process, data by itself does not give it to you. You really have to have everything else around it. You have to have the skills, you have to have the recipes to make the bread, and you have to have the people that are able to apply those recipes to actually end up with the actual result. And that's usually the problem.
Absolutely. And if I was to challenge the industry, there are two things that the industry suffers from within the data world, which have a really profound effect on what hypotheses you can actually test. The first is that the industry is typically really bad at linking data together. So that immediately, as soon as you start linking data together, you might probably be able to test some new hypotheses that might create you a lot of value. The second area where the industry really struggles is the data on the actual asset that's being insured. And being clear that things like IoT will have a very profound effect on how you think about the data around the asset that you're insuring and what you then do with it. But data is not the thing. The thing is you need to get the data, you need to get the data to work for you, but then you've got to create the services on top, which allow you to take out the cost, allow you to sell, underwrite more insured products, all that good stuff. But it's really understanding where are the complexities in it and how do you better serve your customers as a result.
And that leads us nicely actually into the next area of discussion, which is the kind of practical challenges that I think, Enrique, you just touched on, but I'm going to ask you to just elaborate a little bit more. You touched on people processes around baking your flour. How do you approach those challenges in your experience? How have you overcome them?
Well, as I said, the first step is to realize that data is just the first step. And in fact, even if you just look at data, you have to realize that the quality of the data is a big question. Meaning, is the data that you can have, is it strongly aligned to what it is that you want an answer for? Because just because you have data, it doesn't mean it's the right data necessarily, or even if it's fresh data, let alone the fact that the quality of the data, it could be an issue, meaning it's gone through various levels of reprocessing in its lifespan, and therefore by the time you get it, it could be polluted by all sorts of intermediaries understanding what the data is. I mean, in an insurable asset, one of the things could be, for instance, the definition of what a risk is and how that information is transferred through the various elements of the value chain until it gets to you. So by the time it gets to you, your understanding of the risk could be very different from where it started, simply because it went through a whole set of intermediate steps where it was re-elaborated, aggregated, and split out again. So what you get at the far end is not necessarily close enough to what you need it to be in order for you to achieve what your objectives are. So quality of the material is fundamental here, and alignment to your objectives. Understanding what is it that you want the answers for is the other big challenge, because most of the time, the first step and the easiest one to solve is, I need data. Yeah, well, create a big data warehouse, buy data, or get data feeds coming to you. Fine, but, and then what? What do you do?
Yeah.
The rest
Enrico, can I just pick up on that? Because I just want to be slightly, come on, it's a Wednesday afternoon. We need to be slightly provocative and push it
Graveyard
around.
shift.
Yeah, it's a graveyard shift. We need to warm this up a little bit. So I have a pet hate for data warehouses, and I have a pet hate for data quality. And mainly because there are an awful lot of projects out there, not just in the insurance industry, but all over the place, where they build very large data warehouses that add the square. They add the square root of zero as value.
Yeah.
And there's also large numbers of organizations that build huge data quality teams and don't actually ever solve the problem and don't really understand. Now, we have to reset this debate, and there's two very crucially important parts of how we think about data. The first one is data is something that moves. It is not something you store. So the idea of having a record, a data record, I'm minded again by the Lloyd's blueprint. The idea of having a record and a spine, frankly, is very 1980s. Let's move on. That's why the NHS spine failed. So let's move on from spines. Data is something that moves around. Now, the other thing about quality is data is always bad.
Yep.
The question is, are you measuring what we talk about is measurement error. So are you measuring the error, and do you know how to deal with that error?
Yep.
If you have to start from the assumption that all your measurements have error. So the question is, how do you then deal with that error, not go and clean it up? The other observation as part of quality is, instead of trying to clean the data up, go and talk to the bit of the organization that might be generating the data in the first place. So if you've got a fairly clunky process where potentially it's been done paper-based and it's then hand typed into some really dodgy VT100 green screen, unsurprisingly, the data will be rubbish. So then the question is, digitize the front end, and you'll, with a load of validation on the front end, and you'll probably clean up your data. You don't need to build a data quality team to do that. You need to sort out your digital service, and you need to improve that for the users. And this is where we tip a lot of this on the head. Don't think about data warehouses and don't think about data quality. Start thinking about data that moves around, and start thinking about measurement error being as important as the thing you are measuring, and then be clear how you want to use that measurement error in the things you do.
Yeah.
Enrico, Abdul, I don't know whether I'm making much sense.
Absolutely, 120%, yes.
Well,
absolutely,
it's
yes.
provocative. I'd give you that much.
Go on, Abdul.
The thing about data, particularly data quality, is that it's expensive, very expensive.
Yes.
So the solutions are obvious. The first solution is it has to be as good as possible when it comes in through the door. In your example, Dan, making sure that data capture is done right at the beginning and properly. There's no question. The second thing is to say we can't have 100% accurate data. So is the data we have sufficiently accurate for the purposes that we are wanted to subject to? And if not, how do we resolve it? And there'll be cases where the data we have is simply not right. and no amount of cleaning it will actually help it because it's fundamentally flawed. In some cases, some clearly targeted cleanups are sufficient to give us enough of the picture to make some decisions. But, and this is where we go into the concept of probability. Data, in my mind, can never give us a yes or no answer. It will always give us a range of possibilities, and we need to be able to deal with that.
Okay, so I mean, our experience is quite different actually, because from the perspective of do data quality projects work, and I think they do, because remember, certainly within the London market, this is syndicated data. So you may not be the owner of that data, you might be a follower, or the broker might be supplying the data. So I think that some of those data quality interventions are necessary, because obviously then we are contractually bound to agreeing what is stated on the policy or the slip. So I think that is absolutely necessary. I think from the perspective of data warehouses, I think they absolutely do serve a purpose. Is it the modern architecture and potentially what we kind of are likely to see in the next 5 years? Probably not. But I think in terms of the function that they've performed, in terms of pure operational reporting, fiduciary reporting, Solvency II and Lloyd's return reporting, I think they're probably necessary for now. I think whether they kind of either have a shelf life in the future, obviously that remains to be seen. But I think it's the nature of the system that we currently operate in, essentially within how messages are sent from USMs, SCMs, how we kind of transact information, how slip entry kind of continue kind of dominate how information is kind of captured and stored, and subsequently it doesn't move that around that much, because I think we're not certainly within the banking environment or telco where we've got fast moving data. The data is relatively slow moving, and having instantiate data in a warehouse kind of serves the purpose. And I think certainly with the size of some syndicates and brokerages where either there's legacy thinking and there's probably legacy tools, I think to kind of that investment required to kind of move to the next generation is quite tricky. So I think there's almost like the barrier to change as well, and I think the ecosystem currently doesn't support actually getting data at a faster rate, whether you're kind of looking at streaming or more sophisticated ways of kind of ingesting data. We're kind of actually bound by the ecosystem in terms of currently operates, because beyond that, it doesn't make economic sense to kind of completely radically change out unless a better solution comes around, rather than kind of pioneering something specifically for the syndicate or brokerage. That's what I'd add to that debate, Dan.
Yeah, but Abdul, I mean, I weirdly, I recognise exactly what you just described.
Yep.
But I'm also going to challenge you head on, clearly.
Yeah.
Let me try and give you an example, because not insurance now. This is in the finance.
Yeah.
But the finance industry has had a very similar traditional view of, well, we get data from brokers.
Yeah.
In the case of finance, it's investment brokers as opposed to insurance brokers. There's not very much we can do about it. We have to clean it up. It's all a bit of bag of shit, and we have to store it in a data warehouse. Right, it's kind of the same.
Yeah.
Now we are right in the middle at Zulka. We're right in the middle of reimagining that for a very, very large bank, where they've suddenly realised that they have to engage their brokers and make it the broker's problem to solve, at the same time as really helping the brokers improve their digitisation so that they are really solving their own problems, so they themselves are able to manage it more appropriately, because they also struggle. And the parallels are very interesting, because then they start realizing that they should be pushing the data quality issue back in the first place. And then once they've got the data coming into the bank, in this case, they can really add to how it moves around the bank and is used in a more timely fashion for things they want to do.
Yeah.
So, but it really does. It needs an upwelling of people. With not you can't do it on your own. Yeah. You have to do it with everybody. You're going to have to take the brokers with you.
Yeah.
When you say, look, this current setup is with slips is just not good enough.
Yeah.
We as an industry need to rethink how we do the handshakes around data. I mean, we talk about data exchange as one mechanism, and really make that flow. The challenge for the industry is going to be, I mean, we're working with an insurance company in the young drivers automotive market at the moment. And what's interesting is when you start putting IoT devices inside a vehicle to track asset and track how the driver's using the asset, it changes how you think about insurance completely, right? And it's a very simple example. Everybody knows the young driver insurance market, but you can extend that to all the other assets that are insurable. I say, so if I've got an oil rig in the middle of, I don't know, let's just pick up somewhere down in Florida, right? Why aren't we looking at the IoT that's coming off that oil rig to understand what the drilling conditions are, right? And what we can take away in terms of insurability of the asset. There's so many examples where you could just go off and say, well, there's different ways of thinking this through. And that's the profound change that's likely to start occurring in the market, which is where the market needs to get its act together, because you can, like in all the other spaces, you can bet your bottom dollar somebody at some point, and it's probably not going to be a Tesla, but it might be a Google, turns up and does something really radical, which changes the industry, and nobody's going to see it coming until it's too late. And I think that's true for all the industries at the moment, right? So the question is, how does the market come together to really start to resolve some of this?
I think it's quite interesting. It picks up some points there that were made in the opening session this morning, where Paolo from BRICS was talking about kind of operational and so technical debt and operational debt, and I think underpinning that is some of the data challenges that have been put forward here. I just wondered, do you have a response to that, Abdul? The way that this market works, it is slow. The way that it develops is, the pace of change is slow. And I just wonder whether, how much of the stuff that Dan was talking about there with IoT devices is it's going to work without some kind of fundamental change. And I want to come on to this question that I've seen in the chat about open APIs and banking and stuff, but I'm going to leave that for a minute.
Yeah. So I mean, I think, look, I'm kind of encouraged by a number of the developments and innovation that's taking place in the marketplace. I mean, I kind of share Dan's view in as far as, I've kind of historically working within banking or telco or energy and a number of other industries, and the pace of movement and change has been much more accelerated to what we've had in the London market, really. So I think the challenge that we find sometimes is, the model, the underwriting model within the London market is actually quite different to some of the examples that I guess you mentioned, Dan, in terms of commercial lines or personal lines, where you've got the data is highly homogeneous. It's quite rich. You've got access to it in terms of it's quite structured, and we've got enough external data to kind of support our understanding of the risk. Often that doesn't currently exist, and the will kind of limit our ability to completely digitize those things. So in terms of how you then kind of overcome some of the practical challenges, I think it's for us, it's been almost like twofold. Obviously, first and foremost, it needs to kind of link to what your business propositions are. So if you ultimately are a lead market, you're a lead market, so you're assessing the risk, you have that expertise to set price, and also obviously do that heavy risk engineering. That your proposition is slightly different to someone who's actually following, because you're following the lead. Your proposition is actually how you can kind of deliver. Ultimately, how you can kind of deliver efficient capacity. So you may not need to know about a significant amount of information about the risk. So the problem that you're trying to solve is quite different. And the technology challenges that you may then face are completely different. But because we work within the syndicated environment, we're not an island. So what will happen is actually absolutely in some areas you can kind of innovate, but unless the whole market moves, and I think, I'm not sure, I didn't join some of the other sessions, but if there was discussion came around in terms of how we have common data standards, because obviously that same risk is essentially shared amongst all the other participants. So obviously the quality of the data of that the lead is provided is actually then disseminated amongst all the other followers. Unless that radically changes and we have standardization, then actually some of that innovation is quite tricky to really accelerate with. And I know you mentioned there's the much more IoT-based data, and there's much more sophistication within insurtechs in terms of what information that you can kind of glean about the risk. But often what will happen is actually, you kind of understand the nature of how sometimes a business is transacted. That information may not be available to you at the point of you're making that risk decision. For instance, an example I've kind of used is actually, some clever data science analysis was kind of performed on the characteristics of loss, and I'm just making this up for now. So just imagine, you found the characteristics of loss was actually left-handed captains are less likely to cause collisions. So actually that is not information that you have at the point of use. So sometimes a lot of the information that is quite useful and makes a lot of sense or great ideas, you don't have that information that you available at the point of transaction. So sometimes it's almost like, how do you separate what is valuable, what fits within the value chain is actually achievable and practical? Because and some of the radical change in terms of that kind of makes sense and a good idea, but that is not available at the point of use. Or actually, that's not one of the question sets that you can have when you're assessing a risk. Or the insured may not even know that information. So sometimes it's almost like actually looking at the practicalities, what is actually achievable within the value chain. Absolutely, we should kind of radically look to change the value chain. But if it might just work for one risk, and actually the rest of the insureds are not able to provide that information, then actually, if you're using that characteristic within a rating or pricing model, actually it does work. So it's actually what data that you can actually make business sense, make sense for us to invest in, that then allows us to kind of meaningfully overcome the challenges, rather than actually it's just specifically within pockets of the industry that kind of makes sense for us to kind of invest and change.
Yeah, but Abdul, can I just pick up, because there is tangential change going on in a different sector. So we've run a project in the last 3 or 4 years where we were building an autonomous vessel and cargo vessels, right? And what's interesting about that is you start saying, well, you've now got a live stream of exactly what that vessel's doing and where and why, and you've got the weather patterns it's operating within. And so the idea of having a transaction at the beginning of a voyage, and you can actually say, well, no, hang on, what about dynamic risk? What about actually looking at how that vessel is being operated? Because I've got a feed, so I know exactly what the vessel's doing, and I know the weather patterns it's operating within the seas. And do I change the way I think about my products as well? And somebody coming in with novel ways of disaggregating that risk in the cargo space is going to be really interesting in the market, right? Now, that's the sort of challenge that the industry has, because not only are you changing how the product transacts, but you're changing what you then base the product on in terms of insurable risk. And the corollary, this is why I talked about young drivers a few minutes ago. I'm drawing the corollary with the young drivers, because instead of transacting a personal car insurance every 12 months, that's about a daily change of a premium, right? And this is the point. It's really rethinking how you even sell the product, right? How you sell those services, based on the fact that you can do very different things with data, because you've now got this big fat pipe of stuff coming from your assets, probably. Yeah.
And the stuff we've just been talking about is a really interesting discussion, this, and it kind of feeds into a third area that I wanted to touch on, which is, how do we make it simpler for the whole market? And Dan, you've given some examples about how other industries are changing. Have you got any suggestions, provocations to the industry?
I think the main one is weirdly, it's interesting that you've been talking about technical debt earlier in the day. The big one is that digitizing the front end for brokers, digitizing the front end for consumers, digitizing the people that have to engage with the insurance industry in whichever shape, form they're engaging in. Whether you're an insurer, a reinsurer, a broker, whatever, it doesn't matter. That process needs sorting out fairly quickly. And in the process of doing that, you can start to rethink how you use data. But actually, we at Zulka, we talk about user need. So weirdly, in the data world, we start with, well, what does the users actually need from a product or a service? Because unless you can sort that out, the data doesn't mean very much. Yes, there are some really big ticket things you've got to sort out around technical debt, and you've got to be able to you've got to be able to link the data together, and you've got to be able to sort out measurement error. But the challenge to the industry is digitization is the way to think about how you solve these problems. And data is almost sort of part of that discussion, but the discussion really should be about digitizing engagement with brokers and just digitizing full stop, really. Get rid of this tech debt and bring it into the 21st century.
There's a question. So there's been a few questions about data standards that I want to bring in here, because it follows on from the sessions that we've run previously, and it seems to get to the core of some of the questions around this. And I think this sums it from Tunu. So data standards are fundamental. The London market has struggled to successfully deliver open data standards. Can the panel comment on that? And it also leads on from a previous discussion where we were talking about open banking and whether we would see open insurance. So I don't know, Enrico, have you got any thoughts around that? Data standards?
Yes, I always have thoughts. Whether they're right or not is a different matter. So here the problem we have specifically to the London market, that it developed early. So it's a nice early form of integrated digital market, but it's an integration that goes back to the 1980s technology and has not evolved over time. And moving the entire market, the entire chain of systems that support it at the same time is an enormous job.
Yeah.
At the same time, you have to do it. I mean, there is simply no way. In the same way that is another analogy, the woolly mammoth was a very good early example of a mammal, so definitely a lot better than the dinosaurs, but they're not around anymore. They've been out-competed. So the need to organically change is an absolute must. Now, how to do it? That's the big question. And a gradual transformation, so an evolutionary transformation, is the only possible answer, because practically speaking, unless you're a completely greenfield outfit in a completely new market, you have to deal with legacy. So you have to gradually migrate. But the point here is that you can't be a resistor. You have to be pushing towards the new world rather than trying to hold back as much as possible from the old world. Otherwise, as I said, you end up in the tundra somewhere under, the permafrost and be discovered later.
No, I'd kind of just echo that actually, because I think if the London market needs to kind of it's almost like potentially face an existential crisis in the long run, really, because we kind of obviously desperately need to modernize and kind of remain relevant as an insurance market of the future. And how we digitize, back to some of Dan's points in terms of standardization and how other industries have done it. I think that it is a soluble problem. I think the challenge is twofold, really. It's just because typically IT investment historically has been quite slow within the London market, and even like process evolution. So I originally started in the London market maybe about 17 years ago, and I took a 10-year break, came back. It was exactly the same, and I took another 6-year break, came back. It is exactly the same. So there's almost like that inertia for change. And then actually, historically, we've not done a lot of like significant investment in IT, and that years of underinvestment has actually almost like bedded in that inertia for that legacy. Those systems become much more bedded in, and also embedded in much more legacy mindsets. So the challenge is actually market problem, because no carrier or broker is an island. In as far as we can't independently just decide to do something different because it's a syndicated market, because you can transact quite digitally or quite in a much more modern way. But I guess if you want to take the whole market along with you, actually everyone needs to change, because for your 5% of the risk, you've kind of really done that quite efficiently and effectively, and you provided that capacity. But the rest of the players are still kind of playing catch up. So your effectiveness is as fast as the rest of them. Fine, you probably have some advantage in providing efficiency to the broker, but if the broker is not digitally enabled, sometimes it causes a bit more friction. So it is a market problem, and then we need to kind of take lessons in terms of how other industries have done it. And as I said, the problem is not insoluble. It's just that mindset, certainly from that legacy how that legacy mindset and legacy technologies that we need to kind of overcome.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And I think it's interesting, the discussion about, if we go back to the question about data standards, honestly speaking, data standards is trying to solve the problem from the wrong end. Yeah, I mean, you're trying to put lipstick on a pig, frankly, right? And this is one of the reasons I don't like data quality teams. Data standards are very important, but they should be something that emerges from how you go about replacing your legacy estate. They're not, what you don't do is try and design a data standard and then sort of say, oh, this is nirvana, right? We now need to shoehorn everything into it. Not going to work. And actually, I think one of the interesting areas for the insurance markets to look at is actually how the British government has dealt with this problem over the last 10 years, ironically, because they have a very significant tech debt in some legacy IT estate that's 70s and 80s, very similar. And the way they've approached it is by focusing on citizen services and user need, and using that as a way of switching off old systems. So they've slowly but surely gone through the estate, sorting out how they serve citizens, and then very gradually been getting rid of the technical estate, the tech debt that's been sitting underneath it, and switching off old 80s and 90s legacy systems that frankly are not fit for purpose. But they focused on citizens, and they focused on delivering services to citizens better. And actually, this is the learning for the market, is to say, focus on delivering services to the brokers and out to the customers better, and then use that as and do it as a market, but use that as the way of collectively then working out what to switch off from the legacy estate. And as you do it, you'll get emerging data standards about how you integrate on APIs and all that good stuff. And the data standards will happen naturally as part of you upgrading. But what you can't do is write a data standard and then try and shoehorn it into the old stuff, because you'll carry on doing it. By the way, the banks have got themselves in a bit of a problem as well, doing a very similar thing in the finance space, right? They're trying to do data standards all over the place. PSD2 famously in the finance space. Yeah, if you look at the modern fintechs, PSD2 for them is just bread and butter. But if you look at the old banks, they've tried to shoehorn PSD2 into everything, and they've got it horribly wrong, because they haven't solved their fundamental problems, which is they're still sitting on legacy technical debt. So yeah, data standards are there, but they should be something that emerges, not something that is written down in tablets of gold and then handed out to everybody as if it's the nirvana.
And it's not cheap. The other thing
Indeed.
is investment in money and effort. It doesn't just happen. You don't just get it and suddenly everything is better. So there's a whole process, organically grown by all means, but it needs to be processed proactively, chased in order to get to the end, and realizing that there is never an end, right? There's not like, oh, we got there. No, it's never going to be the case, because evolution, right? Life evolves, and the financial markets evolve, the products evolve, the regulatory environment evolves, so technology evolves, blockchain versus old-fashioned client services. I mean, there's all sorts of reasons why what you got to is not the end point. It needs to be the starting point for where you need to get to next.
There's a question coming here about standards. That's Enrico, it's aimed at you. The Rubicon initiative around data standards and based on the Accord messaging. Do you think the same thing needs to happen within Blueprint 2?
So, first of all, the Rubicon initiative did not build a data standard. The Rubicon initiative leveraged a business process and the associated data standards as publicized and developed by Accord. So it didn't just decide, a group of people didn't just turn up one day and say, well, let's define our own processes and let's define our own data standards. It's actually an evolution of prior efforts contributed by all sorts of other parties, going back all the way back to the 70s. So we are not solving a new problem. As Dan pointed out, is a problem that has been attempted and improved on over a number of years, over a number of iterations with failures, because of course, with evolution, right, you get dead branches and then you get the next generation and you keep on improving. So Ruchicon did this. And the way that Ruchicon is different from, let's say, just getting an arbitrary standard implemented is that in the Ruchicon world, it is demonstrated that for the Ruchicon business processes, which are fundamentally global reinsurance and large corporates, that standard with those processes supports the current business environment, supports it really well. I mean, that's one reason why my company specifically has invested significantly in internal and external systems along those lines, because it works. It simply does work. It gives you efficient processes. Is it the end all and be all of, you know, whatever we're going to next? No, it's clear. But is this the starting point for the next evolution? Yeah, very likely, yes. You don't want to reinvent the wheel every time. You want to refine it.
So what I'll add to the data standards discussion is actually, so it's kind of a real problem. I think a number of, you know, certainly from a carrier perspective, and obviously some of my engagements with brokers. So if you look at the range of different products or classes and different products, some of those products are quite homogeneous in terms of they've got very similar characteristics, and you know, they're like a house and it's got you know, it's located somewhere. But some of the different products are quite different characteristics, and some challenges that we're kind of facing, we're trying to kind of solve with some of our broker partners is actually, okay, when we receive a submission that kind of gives the characteristics of the risk for us to be able to digitally price that, we can't create one, because it's actually, you create that a standard by product. So we can't create a point-to-point solution for one broker, and then another broker, we create 10 other point-to-point solutions. It's almost like this example of actually they're throwing a baseball and we've got baseball gloves, but another broker's throwing us a cricket, a rugby ball. So we need to then buy a rugby, a hand or something like that. So it kind of goes on and on. In the ad, and that is by product. It is not by asset class or the class of business. And if you kind of explode that out between asset class of business and segment and product, then actually you're talking about thousands of different standards by n number of different brokers. So that's why standards is ultimately important, actually. And if that is not established, the costs and complexity and our ability to kind of actually accurately assess risk, price, and respond back to the market, it becomes incredibly difficult. So it is a kind of quite major issue, and it's something that obviously a number of carriers and brokers are currently looking at. I think, you know, is it going to be soluble at some point? Absolutely. But I think if the product is homogeneous, does the data exist? How distributed it is? What is the time scale for that convergence to happen? I think those are still kind of big unknowns. And you know, it is one of the key barriers to much more digital trading on scale. I think it's still a necessary problem. I'm not sure what, you know, if the Accord standard what work is kind of going to progress on that. But I think there might be some areas that, you know, it might be a market-based solution rather than waiting for Lloyd's.
True, but the Accord standard provides you the framework by which you can describe a ball, whether it's a rugby ball or it's a football or it's a cricket ball. They're basically, you know, spherical. Yeah. Now, if you're trying to define a crate using a standard that actually is designed to define balls, then obviously it's not going to work, right? Yeah. So that's where the standard fails. The Accord standard has a number of crates, frameworks, balls frameworks, and whatever else you think of at the moment for the reinsurance, global reinsurance, large corporates, such that pretty much anything fits in there at this point. You come up with something that's completely different, and obviously that breaks the paradigm, and then you're on your own, and that's fine. But that's evolution, right? Yeah.
Very good. Look, I realise we are rapidly running out of time. 45 minutes, absolutely flying there. So thank you, gents, for really interesting discussion. So thank you, Abdul, Enrico and Dan for your contributions and making the debate. Thank you very much.
Cheers.
Thank you. Have a good day.
And just remains thank you to all of our speakers today over the past 2 days, in fact, and thank you all for your questions and taking part in the polls. We will see you soon with a series of panel discussions, webinars and virtual roundtables, as well as the events coming up. But for now, thanks very much for tuning in, and we'll see you at the next event. Thanks a lot.